Welcome! In this video, we are going to UV unwrap and texture these wooden parts. In this video, you will actually also learn a lot of problems which you might encounter while UV unwrapping. First of all, we need to UV unwrap these parts. With UV unwrapping, we have to always keep in mind where to put our UVs. In the case of these pillows, we actually knew where to put them, right? These are pieces of cloth, and we put these pieces of cloth together. So you can see these seams actually make sense. Also, the seams are kind of hidden, right? So they are hidden inside of here. This is also handy because then you have no discontinuation in your cloth where it doesn't make any sense. You cannot always do this. So for this wooden piece, for instance, the seams might show. So for models like these legs, or even this piece underneath, we kind of want to hide our seams. So let's start with that now. We're just going to start with this. And the first thing that I want you to notice is that a lot of this model, or a part of this model, I should say, is inside of this leg. And it's not necessarily bad, but you could imagine if this happens for two of these, and then on both sides, that we do not really have any more geometry, but this geometry that we have here will take more space into our UV map. So it will essentially take more pixels away from our texture map, and we don't want that. So you will probably want to scale this a bit down around the x-axis, right? So scale x, and then here. And in this case, nothing really changed from whatever we can see, but we, on both sides, have less space taken up in our texture maps. Awesome. We talked about hiding our seams. If we just put a seam just straight in the middle here, we might be able to see it. Like if we render it here, you can just see a cut through. Doesn't make any sense. So this point here in the back is probably the best hiding spot. Now, we can also see that we have a bevel modifier. You do not always have to apply the bevel modifier, but in this case, I do think it is handy because it creates such a big shape inside of our scene. If we just click on hide and unhide, you can see that it really creates a huge shape. So in this case, I would like to apply it, and then just select this edge here, Ctrl E, mark seam, A, U, and unwrap. You can see that the unwrap object has non-uniform scale. It's a little bit of a problem. We can also go into the UV edit to see this problem. In most cases, you will be like, I don't really see any problem. But let's go into object mode with tab, Ctrl A, apply the scale, go back into edit mode, A, U, unwrap, and here you can see that it's slightly moved. So because we only scaled it a little bit down, it didn't make huge differences. But it could make big differences with other models or if you scaled it in any position. So that error, non-uniform scale, just means that you have to apply the scale, right? Okay, we're gonna do exactly the same for this piece. And also here, I do think up here might be a good hiding spot for our seam. So apply the bevel. Then select this edge, Ctrl E, mark seam, A, U, unwrap. Also for this one, object has non-uniform scale. So apply the scale and unwrap it again. Awesome. So let's go back here and I want to talk about these legs. So the legs only have a mirror modifier. And the mirror modifier essentially mirrors it over. So what do we want to do here? Well, normally I would like to first UV unwrap it and then apply the mirror if needed. And if needed, I'll explain later what that means. So let's first select an edge. And in this case, also, we want to hide this seam. And what we want to think about here is, I'm always going to look at the front of this model. Then you might want to put the seam in the back. But if you want to have a 360 view, in this case, I think the best spot to put this seam would be here. And if you ask why, let me explain. This seam goes all the way from the top to bottom, but there is a huge part which is hidden. So there's actually less visible from the seam, right? So you could do it here, but you will see the seam all the way. And here there's a whole part that is just hidden by these other models. So UV editing, let's create a seam here. Ctrl E, mark seam A, U, and unwrap. And here we can see that, hey, this looks okay, but what is happening here? Sometimes we don't even know where this part might exist in our 3D view, right? So you might be like, is this here in the bottom somewhere or from the top? And you could go and look around your model, or you can put on the UV sync selection, then select the part which you're not sure about, and because of the UV sync selection, oh, by the way, make sure you do vertex selection here, otherwise it just selects everything. So vertex selection, then select it. You can see that because of the UV sync selection, now we only select this part here. So the problem must be here, right? It syncs the selection. And yeah, as you can see, it makes total sense, right? So in this case, I will put an extra seam here to seam off this little bottom cap. A, U, unwrap, and now everything is nice and blue. And we have a little bit of stretching maybe here. So I told you guys about this already. This little setting, UV stretching, is handy, but I personally like to go to shading, create a new texture. Make sure we do this for this wooden material. Rename this to wood, create a new image texture. And we drop this color into the base color and create a new generated type UV grid. Okay, go to the material preview, and here we can see these nice little squares, right? Awesome. So there is not really a lot of stretching. This is because the seam is here, right? That's what we talked about the whole time. And maybe in the bottom there is a little bit of stretching, but I think that's totally fine for right now, right? It's not really that visible. So the same we can do for these models. We can just select them all, then select this one as last with the material applied to it. Click on Ctrl L and link the materials. So we can see that these look decent, but the ones that we have not created any UV maps for still look horrible. So for this one, I will do exactly the same. I will probably select this edge. So edge selection, Ctrl E, mark seam A, U, unwrap. We do know, however, that we probably have the same little problem here. So I will also select this edge loop and then unwrap this. And let's go back to the material preview, and this looks decent. We also have this little button, actually. I totally forgot. So let's go here, create this material. But this button doesn't have anything special, right? So A, U, unwrap, and I will probably do it. It does, however, has a non-uniform scale. So Ctrl A, apply the scale, and then unwrap it again. Now, we have this piece as last. And I want to talk with you guys about this piece because we're just going to follow the kind of basics of UV unwrapping. And I will show you what these modifiers could do to it. Because right now, if we just follow these nice sharp edges around here, all the way around, and here in the bottom, click on Ctrl E, mark seam, then A, U, and unwrap. We do not have any error. We can go into UV editing to see our textures, and we think like, this looks good, right? Nothing is wrong. There's no stretching. Everything is nice and blue. So this probably must be good. However, if we go and look at our material preview, you can see that there is definitely something wrong, right? And this is all because we have the subdivision surface. If I turn this on or off, you can see a huge difference. So the subdivision surface, when it's set to Catmull-Clark, it smooths our geometry out. If I put this to simple, you can see that also it jumps instantly into a nice, normal, uniform, square texture. But we actually want this nice and smooth form because it makes your model look better, and it also generates more geometry, which makes your model look better, essentially. So how can we avoid this? There are multiple ways to fix this. The first one is just looking for a subdivision level or making this model final. So applying the bevel modifier, applying your subdivision level, and then UV unwrap it again. And then create new UV seams. So let's say I'm gonna apply this one, and then you can see that these UV seams are a bit messed up, so you need to clear them and create new ones. That could totally be an option. But what if you want to keep the subdivision surface intact? Then it is a little bit different, right? So if we want to keep the subdivision surface as an option that people still can go lower or higher in subdivision levels, then I would just highly advise you to just add more geometry. And you can see what happens when I add more geometry. The shapes, or essentially this subdivision surface, is not trying to pull all of these shapes together while this essentially smoothing out, right? So adding more geometry really helps here. You can just look at the geometry, see where it is moving. So here I might add one extra one. Here I will add 1 or 2. Here it's still fine. Here in the back. And here. So it could seem weird, but you can see that it totally works. And a nice thing about this, if I use a level viewport 1 or 0, it works just as good as if I put it higher. So we can keep the subdivision surface modifier intact. And that is all that I wanted. Because if I want to put my chair maybe very far away, I can put all of the subdivision surfaces off or even at a very low level. But if I want to zoom in a bit more, I can always put this higher. So if you sell this model or if you want to reuse it later on, you can still do that. So those are my little tips, and now we can start to create the materials. In the last video, you actually saw how we created this fabric material. You just go to shading, select or delete first this image, then select the principled shader, use Ctrl-Shift-T, and then select all of these textures. Principled texture setup. So in this case, there is going to be something different with using our UV maps though. So if we go to UV editing, you can see that this texture is not square. But the program that I used to create this texture does make it in this kind of shape, and it is still seamable, right? It has no seams if I just copy it over and over and over. So I don't really want to mess around with the shape at this point. And we can go here into the material preview and see what the wood looks like. To be honest, this looks very bad. So we can always unwrap it again. Also doesn't change anything. And that is because our UVs are now set up in a way that all of these, I guess, growth rings here are kind of pointed in a way that doesn't really look that interesting. So if we rotate this, so just AR 90 degrees, you can see that this looks way, way better, right? So I can also scale this up here. Just put it nice in place. The nice thing about having these seamless textures is that if I scale it even higher, it will still work because it seams over and over. But scaling it up and up, you will see that it starts to create kind of a pattern, and you want to avoid patterns because then, of course, it doesn't really look like a nice seamable texture. So we're just going to keep it at something like this, and we're going to do this for every single model here. So unwrap it again, rotate, and then they could even overlap, by the way. They don't have to be non-overlapping. So all the models that we have can overlap. Rotate this one as well. So let's talk about the mirror modifiers. That is the last thing, and then we're essentially done. So the mirror modifiers, as you can see, mirror everything perfectly. Also, the seams and the UVs that we have created. If you want the texture to look a little bit different on the left and on the right, you need to apply the mirror modifier. Now, if you just select one of these, so I'm going to select off this, I can move it around, and now it will have a different texture map, or essentially the textures look a little bit different than the other one, right? So this is very handy to create more randomness. And more randomness just makes stuff look more realistic. So do it for all of them. So let's look back here. All of them have a different texture applied to them. If you want, you can still play a bit with the scale, right? So if I want to maybe make everything a little bit smaller, you can do that here. 1.5 might be better than 2, so 1.5. And here we have this nice texture. So let's look in the rendered viewport shading, and it actually starts to look quite good, right, guys? So we can still play around with these textures inside the next video if you think like, something is totally wrong. Like, yeah, we don't really need this displacement, right? So the displacement we can, for instance, delete already. And we can play around with the roughness. Maybe we want a very shiny finish, right? Or maybe we want an even more rough finish. So we can still change that. But in this case, we have created our textures, our UVs, our materials. And in the next part, we can finish this off and also render. So I see you guys there.